Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, The Ins and Outs of Clinical Trials. I am Jennifer Gertz, Executive Director of Food Allergy Canada, and today our expert joining us is Dr. Julia Upton. Before we get started, I wanted to note a few items. Note that this session is for informational purposes only and will not provide specific medical advice, recommendations, diagnosis, or treatment. Please talk to your doctor about any concerns or questions you may have regarding your own health or the health of your child. All participants are muted so we can keep the audio clear for the webinar. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions upon registration. There are some common themes and we'll tackle those in today's sessions. If you have additional questions during the webinar, please submit them in the question box throughout and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. This webinar will be recorded and shared on foodallergycanada.ca afterwards. First, a little background on this session. In February this year, many of you joined us for our session. Well, the session actually happened in April, but in February, there was an approval of Zolar by the FDA in the US for the use within food allergy, a treatment to reduce the risk of reactions to multiple foods based upon results of the Outmatch clinical trial. Until that announcement, the only treatment option that has been made available, but on a limited basis, has been oral immunotherapy. Unlike a decade ago, much more research is underway on including advancing immunotherapy and other treatment options that have the potential to provide alternatives to manage food allergy. So there's lots of conversation opening up the possibilities for treatment options. And the one thing that's essential to their development are clinical trials. This is why we thought it would be helpful for everyone to learn more about clinical trials, what they are, why they're important, and how they inform the development of safe and effective treatment options, and things to consider if you're thinking about participating in one. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Julia Upton with us today. She is on staff at the Hospital for Sick Kids in the Immunology and Allergy Department, is the medical director of the Clinical Research Center at Sick Kids Research Institute, and is an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Toronto. She is also on the board of directors of the Canadian Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology and a member of our Healthcare Advisory Board. In today's session, Dr. Upton will walk us through this topic on the ins and outs of clinical trials, and this will be followed by a Q&A. And then I'll also share with you what trials are currently underway in Canada following that Q&A. Now, before I turn it over to Dr. Upton, we'd like to just have you complete a quick poll. So if we can put the poll question up, based upon what you know, would you consider participating in a food allergy clinical trial? If our listening audience can answer to that, yes, no, or unsure. Okay, so we have 60% saying yes, 30% in the unsure, and 10% in no. Okay, thank you. Dr. Upton, I'll pass it over to you. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction and for this opportunity to speak about clinical trials, which is one of my main loves. And so I really, really appreciate this. And I also look forward to your questions. I do have some disclosures. I do quite a bit of trials. So I have some trials investigating medications from Novartis, Regeneron, Sanofi, ALK-Abelló, DBV. We also have some investigator-led studies funded nationally and by our sort of philanthropic side. And then I also have some roles with Food Allergy Canada as well as the CSACI. So today we're going to cover why a research trial is so important, an introduction to trials. So we'll talk about the different types of trials, all the way from observational up to phase 3 and phase 4 trials. A bit more about placebo, because we definitely get asked a lot about that. I'm hoping to give some information for whether you think a trial is right for you and your family and how to find trials. And then really just making sure that we make sure that trial participants are appreciated. I hope that anyone who's even considering a trial knows just how important it is to advance treatment like this. So thank you. So trials are needed because we have to understand new treatments in terms of their safety So meaning their side effects and their toxicity, as well as the effectiveness. How well does it work versus the other treatments that are already available? Or if there's no treatments, how does it work against placebo or avoidance or no treatment? And really, these contribute to medical advances. Not all of them lead to a new treatment on the market, but hopefully they point us in the right direction. And so a lot of trial conduct is about trying to be as accurate as possible and trying to get the right answer so that we can try to go in the right direction. The main types of trials are observational or interventional. So observational just means that whatever would have been happening continues to happen, but there's data that is being collected. So for example, in a food allergy example might be that somebody is coming to do a food challenge to find out if they're allergic or not to a food. And perhaps around that, there are some questionnaires or some additional blood work to try to investigate a new test, those kinds of things. So that's an observational trial where they would have been getting that anyway, and then some research is kind of around it. And then there's interventional trials where the intervention or the action or the treatment or the medication is under the control of the investigator. So the meaning that the investigator is saying, for this group of people, I'm going to do this, and that might be new versus what the usual care is. So I specifically say interventional rather than a medication because the intervention could be medication, but it could also be education. It could be exercise. It could be lots of different things. So the intervention isn't only meds. Now, for the rest of this presentation, we are going to predominantly be thinking about medications, but really I wanted to highlight that an intervention can be many, many things. And there have been really important educational interventions that have been studied in the past. So this is a busy slide, and then we're going to focus in on it. And this is from CIHR, which is the Canadian Institute of Health Research, just giving an overview of all the different types of interventional trials. So there's exploratory research where it might be just one or two patients that are involved to try to understand new treatments. And then there's also preclinical research where there's lab research. So, the example that I gave previously, where perhaps a blood test is drawn before a food challenge, then they may use that blood to look in the lab to understand if there's a new test that works better, or if there's a way that they can figure out if you're allergic from looking at your blood in the lab. That also includes animal studies. And then there's phase one. So phase one studies are looking at, is the medication or intervention safe in healthy volunteers typically. It can sometimes be people that are affected by the condition, but often it's in healthy volunteers. It's also trying to figure out what is a safe dose and if there's any side effects. Phase two involves more people, and it's asking the question, how well does this work in people with the condition under study? What are the side effects, and what is the safest and most effective dose? So the safety and the most effectiveness, well, certainly the safety is a feature of all of the trials, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, that continues to be monitored. Phase three is then, how well does it work in people with the condition? And again, what are the side effects? And then phase four is after approval, where it's post-approval surveillance to make sure that the medication is working the way that it's expected once it's on the market in a broad group. So just to highlight these more, and to sort of say it just really simply, that exploratory research is really identifying possible interventions. Preclinical research are lab-based studies, either on blood or in animals. And then phase one is safety and dose finding. Phase two is really asking the question, how effective is this, as well as safety and side effects. Phase three is the comparison to the usual or the other treatment that's available, as well as safety and side effects. And you can see all the people there in phase 3. Usually that's a large trial, and we'll talk more about that one. And phase 4 is after approval, again, watching for safety and side effects. So one of the features that I want to introduce here is this idea of equipoise, because if we think of a trial where we need to compare against the usual or other treatment, then we need to be able to ask ourselves, do we think that this is a reasonable thing to do? If there, for example, is a treatment that is obviously a million times better than the existing treatment, then it becomes very difficult to continue the trials, because we really need to be able to ask ourselves, is it reasonable to to give one person the usual care and another person the new treatment? So this is it's called clinical equipoise, meaning that you're just not sure which one is the better way to go. And one of the ways that this is checked is through research ethics approval. So research ethics groups are a group of individuals who are tasked with reviewing studies. And they're guided by these Canadian rules. It's called the Tri-Council Policy Statement. But basically, it's the ethical conduct for research involving humans. And it sets the standard for research ethics boards in Canada. The REB, or the Research Ethics Board, is independent of the study. They don't have any skin in the game. They don't have any reason to want the study to go ahead or to not want the study to go ahead. They're really trying to look at it from the principles of, is this a reasonable study? Does it meet the criteria for to be able to offer for potential patients or participants to join? And there are community research ethics boards, and there as well as academic research ethics boards, as well as hospital-based ones. So, for example, if a family was to do a study in a community office, that research ethics board review might have been done by a community research ethics board, which again still is guided by these important principles. Or if that researcher is part of one of the universities, they may have put the study through their university research ethics board. Or if they are affiliated with a hospital, they might have used the hospital. So it really depends, but all of these different structures are allowed. And so it's not that research can only be done within a hospital or within the university. There are also ways to have community-based research. So again, this phase 3 trial where we're comparing to other or usual treatment, as well as checking the safety and side effects, it's the basis for regulatory approval. And so it really needs to be quite formally done. And when we're asking how well does it work, we need to be able to do that in a structured way. And so in terms of the number of people that are enrolled, typically it's hundreds to thousands of people, and they have the medical condition, because you need to ask how well does this treatment work in the person with the medical condition. So if we're speaking of food allergy, then we would need people with food allergy, and we're asking how well does this treatment work against another strategy, another care strategy. And often in these phase 3 trials, in fact, typically they are randomized. So you could be randomized, meaning they essentially flip a coin that, do you get the treatment that is under study, the intervention, or do you get the usual care or previous care or placebo? And so in terms of this randomization, we often do speak of flipping a coin. You could get heads and you get the treatment under study, or you get tails, or you get placebo. These are typically done by a computer system. And so we're not literally flipping a coin. And also it can be weighted. So the randomization could be 2-to-1 chance of getting the intervention, or 3-to-1 chance of getting the intervention. So it's certainly random, but it doesn't have to be 1-to-1. We call that allocation. So, but the idea is that it shouldn't, the treatment is not based on the person coming into the trial. It's really based on the trial, and it's randomly assigned. There's nothing that you can do to shift the chances of getting the intervention. I think it's really important to just think about that, because I do often get asked, when there is a trial that has a randomization to treatment or to placebo, people ask me, well, can I just be on the treatment? And it doesn't work like that. The investigator is typically not in control of who gets which treatment. It's randomized, at a level of a computer system, so that we can't, pick favorable or unfavorable characteristics to go into one side or one treatment or the other. We also need an outcome in a phase 3 trial. So how are we going, we say, well, a phase 3 trial measures how well does it work, but what is the outcome? So there could be lots of different outcomes for a trial. The important thing is it needs to be predetermined. We need to say before we start the study, how am I deciding if this is successful or not? And there could be lots of different things that you pick. It could be, if, in a peanut allergy study, for example, it could be how much more peanut can you eat at the end without having an allergic reaction versus how much could you eat at the beginning. That could be the outcome. So looking at the increase in the amount of food someone can safely eat. But there's other outcomes. You could have an outcome of quality of life, where we ask in a very standardized way, how are you coping? How are you feeling? How much does the food allergy impact your life, impact your travel, impact your choices? And then look at that again at the end to see if it worked. And so these are there's lots of different ways. We can look at cost effectiveness. We can look at many different things, but it has to be predetermined. What we can't do is take measures for hundreds of different things and then when the study's done, choose the best one, because that just by random chance, if I was to assess hundreds of, of measures of success, a few of them may end up being favorable just by pure chance. So it's really important that the outcome is predetermined and exactly how it's going to be measured for that particular trial. You're allowed to have more outcomes for sure. Many studies have multiple different outcomes, but the primary outcome, or the one that we're going to decide for this study, did it work, needs to be predetermined. These studies are also typically multi-center, and in fact, they can be multi-country. And then they, in addition to seeing how well did it work, they're also monitoring the safety and the side effects. So the double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial is a common structure of a phase 3 trial. And what this means is neither the researcher nor the study participant knows which treatment they are getting randomly. So meaning that that's the double-blind part, that the researcher doesn't know what the treatment has been allocated, and the participant also doesn't know. And then the randomized part we discussed, and then the placebo. So the placebo is what allows us to be double blind. Because you can imagine if we have a study where we say, well, this person's going to get peanut treatment or milk treatment, and the other person is not, if the person who's not taking anything any day, they would know what treatment that they are on. So we need a way to be able to be in a medication trial, to be handing out a medication, to be taking the medication, but it may or may not be the medication. And that's where the placebo comes in. So I like this picture, maximum strength placebo, because placebo really means that there's nothing in it. So placebo is a sham medical treatment, meaning that there isn't anything in it. It should be an inert substance. Um, it might be cornstarch, for example. It might be salt water. It might be lots of different things. The really good placebos look and smell exactly like the medication under study. But the point is that the placebo in and of itself should have no medical activity, no expected medical activity. It is not expected to help the condition. It's an inactive substance, but it's administered as if it is a therapy. And so this is used in clinical trials to test the effectiveness of the actual intervention. So everybody is randomized to something and everybody is taking something. And so all of the parts of a study where you're being regimented, where you're keeping the diary to, take the dose, all of these kinds of things, those are equal across the participants of the study. The difference is the actual treatment itself rather than how the person is being treated. So in food allergy research, it's especially important to have a placebo because the natural history of food allergy is that some people will improve on their own during the time of the study. If we were to study young children with milk or egg allergy, for example, some of them will actually outgrow it within a relatively short time frame. And so it's important to be able to, follow these people and have, really be able to assess properly what was the effect of the intervention. Because if all we do is the intervention and then we have 20 or 30 or 40 or 60% of people outgrow, we may attribute that to the intervention itself, whereas that might have just been the natural history. For some foods, the natural history becomes less likely to have the food allergy be outgrown, such as tree nuts. There's also really strong psychological reasons. And so, as we mentioned, in the previous slides, that we really want to treat the participants the same. So they're all coming for, let's say, injections, or they are all coming to take a pill, or they are all keeping a diary of the pill, these kinds of things. So it's really just the active ingredient in the medication that we are truly trying to isolate uh, for its efficacy and for its side effects. Psychological reasons are also important because some people may have symptoms due to anxiety. And so, again, the placebo is used in clinical trials to test the effectiveness of the intervention, really by trying to keep all of this other stuff equal in the background. So when is the new therapy approved? So it is typically these phase 3 trials that lead to regulatory approval in Canada. That's Health Canada. In the US, it's FDA, where the medication is allowed to be marketed for that indication. And so this is driven by a couple of things. So they need the evidence, the research, the phase 3 trial to show that it is safe and effective. And then they also need the people who make the medication actually have to go to Health Canada or the FDA to actually ask for this approval. So Health Canada is not asking, looking through the literature to say, oh, should we approve this now? It needs to be brought to them by the pharmaceutical company. So if the pharmaceutical company does not advance the treatment, ask the regulatory bodies for approval, then it's not, then there's no mechanism to bring that to the market for that particular indication. And just maybe to highlight that line, so for that indication. So a medication can be on the market for multiple reasons. A medication, for example, may already be approved, to treat asthma, and now people are interested in whether it can treat food allergies. So in order to have that label on the medication, it needs to go through this regulatory process. So now let's chat whether the trial might be right for you. So first, before you have the opportunity to decide if a trial is right for you, then there's eligibility criteria. So people have to meet inclusion and exclusion criteria in order to join a trial. And these are largely driven around safety and efficacy. Later on, the treatment might be approved for a broader group. But when we think of the example I was giving earlier, that some food allergies, for example, can be quite quickly outgrown, that might not be the best population to look at efficacy. Because if I have a treatment that I want to say, well, does this help this food allergy? But I'm faced with, even if I do nothing, 40 to 60% of people are going to outgrow it. That is very difficult to study because I would need a very, very large number of people to be able to see if my treatment actually works or not. Another issue might be safety. So while we absolutely want to treat people with the most severe symptoms, in a study, when we're first looking at does this work, that might not be the group that is the initial focus of the study. And to think more about efficacy, I've picked on milk a little bit, but if I wanted to study milk and I wanted to have a population of people that are less likely to outgrow, there are ways that we could pick those people to try to reduce the rate of natural outgrowing and be able to really look at the intervention. And so, for example, in a study like that, you might see that the study is geared to older people or to so older children or adults, or perhaps there are criteria for how much food could they eat at the beginning, or perhaps there's criteria about how high the labs are, ways to kind of shift the balance to say, okay, I'm going to see a low rate of outgrowing in the people that I am not treating, and I'm hoping to see a higher, I'm hoping to see that I can make a difference with the treatment that I'm researching. So I hope that makes sense. So really, in general, eligibility, inclusion, and exclusion criteria are geared around safety and efficacy. There are also just technical factors. So there may be age criteria that could be because of the condition itself. It could also be because of the hospital that it's being that the condition's being researched in. There could be limits on where you live. There could be the type of allergy, the food, the reaction type, which we talked a little bit on the previous slide about both safety and efficacy. Also, from a safety point of view, there may be other medical conditions or other treatments. It is quite common in food allergy studies to see that certain medications are not allowed in the study, either because of safety or efficacy reasons. So, from a safety point of view, we often don't want some of the blood pressure medications. And from an efficacy point of view, we wouldn't want somebody who is taking other medications that might influence or affect food allergy. There are often laboratory tests that are required both to show to support the diagnosis of the food allergy, and also to try to gear this risk that we talked about. And then often how much food causes a reaction. Often the studies are geared to people that are reacting to quite small amounts, so that again we can try to focus in on, does this treatment help, because we know that that group, with high tests, low amounts of food that cause a reaction, are less likely to see a big difference in the 1 or 2 years of this study, unless they have a treatment. So when you're thinking about a trial, whether it's good for you, you can think about, what are the requirements? How long are the visits? How frequent are they? What are the risks and the benefits? What is the alternative? Do you have to join the study to get the treatment that you're interested in? Will you know the outcome of the research? How will the outcome be disseminated to you? And where is this in the overall pipeline when we're thinking back to those original slides? Is this really at the stage where we're asking ourselves, is this safe? Or are we at a phase 3 now where we're asking, does it work? And then, if this is a really important question, that if you or your child receive benefit from the trial, will you actually have access to it once the trial ends? Or what will be the plan for when the trial ends? And many of these things are covered, in fact, really all of them are covered in the consent. And so I'll just start with the basic elements of the consent, and then deep dive it a little bit more. But really, in order to make a decision, you need to know, what is the nature of the procedure? What is the investigator asking you to do? And what are the risks and benefits of this procedure? What are the alternatives? What are the risks and benefits of the alternative? And then, just making sure that you have had an opportunity to reflect on and ask the questions to ensure you have the understanding of these above items. And it needs to be voluntary. It's really important that it doesn't feel coerced, that it doesn't feel, well, this is the only way that that we can help you. It's important that it's a voluntary process to consent to a research study. So these are, just an expanded list of the elements that are in a typical consent form. And so there's a title, there's who's doing this research, where's the funding coming from? Is this was this independently sourced, independently funded, or is the funding coming from the company? Of course, an invitation to participate, the purpose of the study. And so that's where we were talking about the outcome. Like, how are we going to judge success in this study? What are we actually aiming to do? What specifically will you be asked to do or not do while you're in this study? And then, of course, the age and the criteria. We talked about the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So, who can take part in it? The risks and the benefits is a dedicated section in the consent where it's important to disclose any reasonable or serious risks, as well as what we think the benefits may be, the compensation and reimbursement, which I'll talk about a little bit more, the privacy protections. Now, in all studies, data is really important, and it's essential to know who is getting what information about you, where is this information going, and how is it being guarded and protected. And that's an element of the consent. What will be the reporting of the results? And will you get to know the reporting of the results? Some studies you get independent results of yourself, but most you get aggregated results where you know what happened in the study overall, but not necessarily your individual lab tests or results. How do you withdraw from the study? This is always allowed. You can always withdraw from a study, and it's important that the consent makes that clear to you that you can stop. I'm sure you went in with the best of hope and intentions, but if it's not right for you, then you can withdraw. What are the conflicts of interest of the investigators? And that's another essential component of the consent. How do you contact people? You do need to be able to contact the research team. And then there's a signature page. So what's important is that signature is really only one aspect of the consent. It's really important that all of these things are understood. And it's not just about the signature. It really is, consent is a process, we like to say, and it doesn't start and end with signing one line on the study. It is often, certainly the way we do it here is that we ensure that you have the consent at least 24 hours in advance, and that you have the opportunity to read it, to think about it, talk to your family, potentially talk to your other physicians about it, to really decide whether it sounds right for you. And then there's also the clear opportunity to ask questions, both of the research team, just for sort of technical aspects, like how many visits, how long are they, those kinds of things, as well as the investigator, more about the risks and benefits and the medical questions that can come up. There's a term that I wasn't very familiar with until I was doing research studies, is assent. So assent is where a child also agrees to the study. And it's an interesting thing. And I know Food Allergy Canada is, of course, countrywide, but the rules for consent and assent actually differ by province. So in Ontario, where I am, there is no age of consent. Consent is about, do you fully understand all of those aspects that I discussed, and can you, give your consent to do that study? And you could be 16 and give your consent in Ontario to do the study. Certainly, the younger you get, the more likely it is that you may not understand every single nuance of, especially a phase 3 study. And so what is common is that the parents give consent, and then the children give assent. And so assent is where they understand a lot of the study, but not necessarily every single aspect, but they understand it enough to appreciate that they have a role in this and somebody is asking them to do something here. And so the basic elements of assent, and these are not as regulated, they really are geared to the age of the child. But in general, they also have to know the title and who are we, who are the researchers, to be invited to participate, recognizing that it's voluntary. That's the point of the term invitation, that it really is a voluntary option to join a study. And why are we doing it? What's going to happen? We tend to use this sort of phrasing for children. Can anything bad happen to you? Will it help you? Who will know that you're in this study? That's the privacy discussion with a younger child. Do you have to be in the study? And the answer is no. And what will happen afterwards, and any questions, and then the signature page. And for young children, the signature may be that the study team signs that they had this discussion rather than the child themselves doing a signature. But that can differ depending on the institution. So where would you find trials? So clinicaltrials.gov lists trials. They do endeavor to be patient friendly and person friendly. And they recently underwent a bit of a revision where I do think it's easier to navigate. And you can search by city, you can search by condition, you can search by researcher, quite a few different ways. Food Allergy Canada, over the last few years, has also been acting as a resource for food allergy trials across the country. And that's their website there. Your doctor may know about trials, and some of the academic hospital sites also have their studies listed in various places within the website. And as promised, I really just want to appreciate trial participants. So in terms of the structure of the trial, there is a built-in system to recognize the trial participants. One of the ways is that when you join a clinical research study, typically there's some degree of reimbursement. So by coming to the hospital all day or coming to an office all day, you may be reimbursed for meals, travel, your time. There can be volunteer hours, and there can also be certificates of recognition. This is not meant to be uh, coercive, so the reimbursement really should not be more than it shouldn't be at the level that it makes somebody want to do the trial that would not have wanted to do it. It's meant to be geared at the level that of true appreciation and recognition of the time that they are spending contributing to clinical research. And again, that type of thing is moderated and reviewed by the Research Ethics Board to try to get that balance right. So in summary, the clinical trials are really essential to develop new therapies, and they are reviewed and regulated at multiple levels. And I would love to answer your questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Upton. I'm going to ask you to turn your camera on, and I'll do the same, and we'll go through some of the audience questions. Anyways, thank you so much for taking your time. We're going to start with kind of the first theme of questions around type of trials. Okay. And if you could quickly go through again, that synopsis of phase one does this, phase two does this, phase
Mhm.
three is this, and phase four is that. If you can just kind of remind the audience of that.
Yes, for sure. So phase one is safety,
Yeah.
as well as dose finding. And I will say that there is no official, it's not written on a tablet
Right.
from, in stone from 100,000 years ago. But that these are the general terms are that phase one is safety and dose finding. Phase two is again continuing with safety, but now it's looking at the intervention itself. How well does it work in people with the condition under study? And again, continuing with side effects. And so
Right.
the difference between phase two and phase three really comes down to the numbers and also the rigor of the trial. So by the
Okay.
time you get to phase three, it's also asking how well does it work? But
Right.
at that point, it is typically randomized,
Yeah.
blinded, very controlled, really trying to have a high standard of evidence to understand how well does this work, because it's
Okay.
what's used for regulatory approval. And then
Okay.
phase four is the intervention, or the typically drug is already on the market, and now there's ongoing studies to look at. So is it working like we expected? Is it working like it did in those phase two and phase three trials? Because once it is prescribed widely, the population of people that are receiving this medication could be different. They may
Right.
not be the same, they may not have the same follow-up. They may not have the same exactly the same labs, exactly the same other conditions as other people.
Right.
So that's the point of the phase 4, to make sure that once it's actually on the market, it's working like we expect
Right.
and with the
It's
safety
kind
that
of
we expect.
more in a sort of a real life sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Now, in the placebo double-blinded controlled study,
Yes.
randomized controlled study, why is it that it's blinded for the people that the healthcare professionals that are delivering
Mm.
the treatment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the reason that it's blinded for the healthcare provider is so that we cannot sway the outcome.
Okay.
So, for example, there's a lot of opinion in many aspects of medicine. So for example, if I was doing a food challenge and somebody sneezed, a couple of times, I might view that differently if I know what treatment they're on.
Right.
And so we're always trying to remain the highest level of objectiveness in these
Right.
trials, and one of the ways to do that is for the investigator to have no idea which one they're on. So you
Got it.
really have to be as objective as possible to assess how well did it work, is this person having side effects or not, all of these things. And then the same for the person themselves. Well, probably I made more clear why the person taking the medication, why it's so important. But you're right, I didn't highlight why it's important on the investigator side.
Okay. That makes sense. Now, like, how do we actually, or how does an individual know that a trial they might be hearing about is legitimate? Right? Like, is there? And maybe there's no evidence of this that this would be happening, but if someone's being served up a clinical trial, how do they know that trial has been kind of embraced by the various different groups from an objective standpoint?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Certainly the Research Ethics Board has a role in that. And when
Right.
we think of, I mean, there's a number of elements there. So who's performing the research? In the consent, it gives you the background as to why they think that this may or may not be helpful. There's a disclosure of conflicts of interest within the consents, so that you understand, whether the research team has anything to personally gain. And all of these are regulated by the Research Ethics Board. So I think,
Okay.
um, you know, the one of the necessary elements of the consent is to have on it what is the Research Ethics Board. And
Got it.
I think I would be, very concerned if I was asked to join a trial that didn't have those elements in it, where you
Okay.
can see that there's this board that is external to the study, that really, I think I said, has no skin in the game at all, has nothing
Right.
to gain from whether or not this study is done. And you can independently contact that Research Ethics Board as well. That's a
Okay.
standard element of consent. So I think that would be one of the main ways to make sure that this is legitimate. There is also, often there are cut points in the trial where the investigators are looking at, okay, how is this going, what does this look like, and that's part of the reason there's that escalation of studies as well. So the phase 1, the phase 2, there's often been this background information that is giving you an idea of whether or not we think this is worth pursuing. There's lots and lots and lots of treatments that do not make it to phase 3 trials
Right.
because the previous research really didn't support continuing to go forward with this.
Okay.
So I think that's probably some of the best ways to really look
Okay.
at the consent and see who's doing it and how is it being regulated.
Perfect. Okay, so that look for research ethics and in anything that you're considering. Okay, in terms of participating in trials, if you're a participant um, and it's in a placebo controlled trial, what are the possible risks if you're randomized to the placebo arm?
Right. So in order to have placebo, it has to pass through research ethics approval that it's reasonable to offer placebo. So, as maybe an extreme example, if I was studying asthma and I wanted to study a new medication and I wanted people to have no treatment at all or the new medication, that would be only allowed if their usual treatment was no medication. So,
Right.
if their usual treatment was that they take puffers routinely, then I would need to allow them to continue to take puffers routinely, and then I could look at the new treatment as an add-on or those kinds of things. And so it's the placebo might be placebo on top of usual treatment, in some studies.
Right.
Or it might be that instead you're randomizing between usual treatment and the new treatment. So you
Okay.
cannot, I guess, in summary, you cannot withhold necessary treatment, and that is typically a line item in these in the protocols and in the consents, making sure that you're not depriving somebody of what's needed. And if you are, it has to be extremely well discussed and why that is a reasonable thing to do. So there
Okay.
really shouldn't be there when the studies have been properly done. There shouldn't be a risk per se, because you're getting what the other people are typically getting, is
Okay.
or it's extremely well explained to you why it's been set up the way that it is.
Okay. Okay, I want to now kind of focus on some that are more specifically food allergy related. And so it seems like many of the trials that are out there are focused on peanut. Okay,
Mhm.
and so we have obviously a community that's focused on many more options than just peanut. But is there this ability to apply the learning from these clinical trials to other foods, or do you have to do a phase 3 clinical trial on each allergen? That might be a hard question to answer because I'm sure you're going to say, well, it depends.
So it does depend, but I can parse it out a bit. So in Canada, food is not considered a drug. So some of our audience I know is extremely well versed in the world of food allergy, and in the U.S., food is considered a drug in when you use it in a trial. In Canada, it's not. So if we're talking about the food itself, then I think many of us as physicians have learned from the trials and accept that if it works, if for example, if oral immunotherapy can be beneficial for peanut and for milk and for egg, then there's not a lot of reason to think that it wouldn't be beneficial for some of the other foods. If we're talking about and that mindset is actually in our 2020 Canadian Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology guidelines for oral immunotherapy, that although the evidence is highest for certain foods, there hasn't been any data to say that it's only for those foods. Then, but if we're talking about a pharmaceutical product, if I want to make, an injection, a drug for let's say peanut, then that is different. Then that's a regulatory question, so I can't answer on behalf of Health Canada. But in general, they have seemed to require each and every food,
Okay.
both from a dose finding point of view, and that might make sense, right? I mean, if we think about, one peanut is about 250 milligrams, for example, of peanut protein, whereas a glass of milk is 8,000 to 9,000 milligrams. So just right off the bat, there are potentially, if you're making a pharmaceutical product, there are
Right.
potentially differences in the dose that you might be interested. There may be differences in the safety. There may be differences in other aspects. So from a pharmaceutical development point of view, um, and if we learn from other aspects of allergy, if we think about pollen allergies or bee sting allergies or all those kinds of things, the regulatory standpoint has been that each and every one of those allergens has been treated, you know, as its own
Right.
entity.
Okay. Okay, now we had another couple of questions come in around participating in trials with a child that has overwhelming anxiety.
Mm,
Okay, and I'm sure that you've probably seen this in some of the work that you do, what is your recommendation to parents about that type of situation and how to navigate it?
Yeah, it is. It is really tough, because my experience is that many of these kids do want to be treated, for example, but then they're very understandably very scared of the treatment. So we've seen parents do lots of different things here, and I think some of these actually we are maybe some of the same learning that we've seen in for oral food challenges as well, which is also can be a very scary thing to do, where there's a lot of discussion with the child and understanding of why it might be helpful for them, and understanding of the safety aspects and where they are, and what would happen if they had a reaction. Some parents use reward systems, where the child gets a gift, or I've seen them get a little car for every visit they come, these kinds of things. So really making the child feel valued and giving them as much choice as they can in the process. The bottom line is that if the kid really will not do it, that's where the assent comes in. If they understand and they are absolutely saying no, then we can't make them do it. And so it comes down to really trying to help them to understand why this might be helpful. We have had children here that are hesitant come and do a tour before they come for consent, and many of them actually do agree to do it after that. Some have talked to other families with, of course, full consent on each side, and so then they understand a bit more of what would be expected. So there's lots of different ways, but I think what you're really highlighting is we definitely have a paucity of that kind of support that we need for these children. Another thing that we have, and I know that many of the other hospitals have, is we call it child life here at Sick Kids, but we have clowns, and we have a group that is really dedicated to making a child feel more comfortable and putting control and power where they can. And so there's lots and lots of different ways to try to help them, but sometimes it's not enough.
Okay. Now, I think it's both with children and with adults, and certainly there's more coming for adults, and I'll show that in a few minutes in terms of some of the clinical trials that are out there. Thank you very much, Dr. Upton. This has been a really informative session, and I think people will have learned a lot about clinical trials. We're going to quickly pop up the poll question so we can turn off our webcams. So, based upon what you know now, would you consider participating in a food allergy clinical trial? All right. It looks like we had some good feedback on that in terms of people wishing to participate in trials. So it looks like 100% of those that participated in the poll would consider it. So that's some good news. Let's take a look at what actual research is underway. So in terms of the research studies that are underway, and these ones are listed on foodallergycanada.ca, so you'll find those. The first one is the PATEST study. That's in testing an investigational drug patch for individuals that are between the ages of 4 and 7 with peanut allergy. You can see that the locations are listed there. Come to our website if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that study. We also have the TRADE study. This is testing different immunotherapy delivery systems, so sublingual or what's called SLIT, or a low dose oral immunotherapy. And that one is targeting individuals age 1 to 16 with tree nut allergy, and is located in Hamilton. Another study that's underway, that these ones are now actually, let's talk about clinicaltrials.gov, because that's where you're going to find the information on all the studies. So what you do is you go to this site, you enter in your search term, so in this case, food allergy, and then you can enter in the name of the study if you have it, put in Canada, and then select the study status for recruiting. Okay, and when you do that, what you're going to find is you're going to find some of these studies that I'm going to reference on the next slides. So one is listed as the BOOM trial. It's testing omalizumab with multi-food OIT. This is for individuals aged 6 to 25, and it's located in Montreal and Toronto. There is a peanut sublingual immunotherapy, so that's SLIT. It's a tablet for the treatment of peanut allergy. This is investigating the safety and the tolerability of peanut SLIT. This is geared towards individuals 4 to 65 with peanut allergy, and its locations are in Burlington and in Quebec City. And again, that's listed on the clinicaltrials.gov site. We've also got the IMPROVE study. So this is investigating modified protocols for oral immunotherapy. So it's looking at low dose of food allergens or processed versions of allergens that might be effective in triggering desensitization. That's a age 2 to 40. And then on the thresholds in food allergy, this one's not a therapy per se, but it's helping to try and quantify food allergy thresholds in Canada and what predicts what threshold level. And this is for individuals from 3 months of age up to 65 years of age with a suspicion or history of food allergy. That's located in Hamilton. Okay, so we will be continuing our focus on treatment in the coming months. And in the month of June, we do have one scheduled on advances in immunotherapy, and closer to the end of the year, more on a future outlook on treatment. So you will hear from us on that in the coming weeks and months ahead. But in terms of what's coming up next, first off, we'd like you to complete our post-webinar survey. You will receive that on email, and we'd like you to complete that. On May 29th, we would welcome you to join an interactive session with Dr. Wade Watson, where you can test your knowledge and get an in-depth and understanding of signs and symptoms and treatment of anaphylaxis. Dr. Watson is going to be using some case scenarios to help you build your skills and confidence, and you can register for that now at foodallergycanada.ca/events. And then on the 23rd, we'd ask you to tune into Facebook Live again with Dr. Julia Upton. For this session, you'll gain some better understanding of the devices that might be best for you in the treatment of anaphylaxis, what those signs and symptoms are, and when to use a second dose. And you can RSVP right now on our Facebook event page. We'd also ask you to join in our Know It, Treat It slide. So our Know It, Treat It campaign. It's Food Allergy Awareness Month in Canada right now. So get involved with our Know It, Treat It campaign and share your personal story on anaphylaxis, specifically how you knew it was anaphylaxis, how you treated it. You don't have to have had an anaphylactic reaction to participate. When you share your story, you have a chance to win exclusive prizes, including a $100 Visa gift card. You can also share our animated GIFs that we have on our Give and Go video featuring Hall of Fame NFL football player Jerome Bettis. Also, we've got 50 monuments that are lighting up in teal over this month. So take a photo of those and tag us on social. You can find our schedule of lighting on our site at foodallergycanada.ca/FAAM for all the details. Lastly, I'd like to thank our supporters for today's webinar. We have the Schroeder Foundation, the Peanut Bureau of Canada, DBV Technologies, and also made possible from donations of viewers like you. Thank you for your participation in today's webinar. You can review a recording of this webinar at foodallergycanada.ca shortly, and please also share it with others who you may feel could benefit from this content. This now concludes our webinar.